Don't forget, you're going to die.
Welcome, everybody, to the We Croak podcast. And today we have an important topic and an important guest. We're going to be talking about the death penalty. And I have as our guest Elizabeth Bruenig. She is an Atlantic magazine writer and wrote, I think, the most thought-provoking article on this topic that I have ever read in the July 2025 Atlantic magazine called Witness. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So thank you for joining us, Elizabeth Bruenig.
Thanks so much for having me on.
I want to start with the title, Witness, which is both a reference to what the article is about, which is the many now capital punishment executions that you have witnessed as a journalist. And such a different starting place than any other article about capital punishment that I've read, which is often more about the polarization of the issue, perhaps the moral algebra of how people think about this issue and the two different sides, rather than what is actually happening. So can you just explain how did capital punishment become your beat, and where did witnessing begin?
Yeah, I was always kind of interested in capital punishment as a writer, because it's such a serious thing and because the debate over it is so polarized. And I've always been interested in kind of matters of life and death. I think a lot of really interesting philosophical concepts are litigated in sort of the margins of life and death, which I really enjoy. And it had always just struck me as kind of an intellectual thing, objecting to the death penalty. But when I was at the New York Times, there was a spree of executions in the year 2020. I think there were 13 federal executions in 6 months after like a 15-year hiatus of no federal executions. And at that point, I figured, if the government is doing this thing, if they're carrying out these federal executions, then it makes sense that there would be some sort of observation available to the public. And indeed, a lot of states that carry out executions, as well as the federal government, allow media witnesses to executions. Now, it's very much up to them what kind of media witnesses and who in particular are chosen to witness executions. But still, it's a little more transparency than there would be otherwise. So you just submit your application to the Department of Corrections, in this case, the Indiana Department of Corrections, because the federal government executes at Terre Haute in Indiana. With your name, your credential, the fact that you're a reporter, the sponsorship of your publication, it's just a little paperwork. And then if they choose you, if they select you as a witness, they get back to you and tell you, where to be and when. So I witnessed my first execution in 2020, and those were the circumstances.
Can you talk a little bit about your first time?
Yeah, I sort of didn't know what to expect at all. And what happened is I arrived at this media center, which is just like an office building that's used by the Department of Corrections. It's just where like a conference room is, and so on and so forth. And they station media witnesses in there to wait, because at the sort of 11th hour in stage capital litigation, it's called, there's a lot of stuff that happens all at once. You have appeals usually that go before the Supreme Court, and they either are, they're usually rejected, but waiting to see how the Supreme Court rules, it takes some time and can go down to the wire in terms of timing. They rule late into the night. And so reporters are just on standby in those conference rooms, those media centers, when all the appeals are exhausted and it is time to execute the prisoner. Media witnesses are taken from the conference center and put onto white vans which then take them to the execution chamber on the actual prison campus. Execution chambers are, in every case I've ever seen, separate buildings from the remainder of the prison. And they're kind of like, a wheel with spokes. And in the center is the execution chamber itself. And then there are these smaller rooms, sort of ante-rooms that look in through windows onto the execution chamber. And in those small rooms, there are law enforcement officials, media witnesses, personal witnesses of the prisoners. These can be spiritual advisors, their attorneys, their own family and friends, and then the victims' families often attend executions and have a place reserved for them. We went into the execution chamber viewing room for media witnesses. It was just a small, very hot room with a window in it, folding chairs. They gave us notebooks and pens because you're not allowed to take anything in to the execution chamber, anything at all. So they provided us with writing materials, and then the curtain was opened up, and there was a man named Alfred Bourgeois, strapped to a gurney, sort of cruciform with his arms out, and he already had an IV line set. And he gave his last words. They read him his death warrant. This is standard operating procedure at executions. And then they began the lethal injection. They don't tell you when that's happening. The catheter is hooked to a tube that goes through a hole in the wall in the execution chamber, and you can't see who's behind the wall doing what to the medication. You just know when the person starts to react. Alfred Bourgeois, in this case, sort of heaved and jerked around, clearly struggling in some way before he died. And it took some time. I think it took like 8 minutes for him to die. And then they filed us back out of the witness chamber. It was so hot, and it was a rainy, hot night. And I remember just kind of losing it. And then they put us back in the media center and told us to go our separate ways. They sent out a press release later from the Department of Corrections just saying that it was a successful execution, and they put out a release from the victim's family saying that, it was a relief that it was over.
Wow. You said that you lost it. What does that mean?
I just puked on the concrete. Yeah.
You did. It was. Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, it was like a combination of it being really hot and claustrophobic in that room, and seeing some stuff that was really hard to watch. And yeah.
Did you have a sense of the mood in all those antechambers that you just referenced? Are people here like you who are, you know, having almost a shock reaction to this? Are there other people that seem satisfied and happy to be there? Like, what is the mood of, and how many people are witnessing an execution?
Yeah, so media witnesses, I think there are normally between something like 4 and 6.
Okay.
Then they can be chosen from, different outlets, print outlets, web outlets, etc., TV outlets. And I've seen personal witnesses for the prisoner number about 6, typically 4 to 6. And then I don't know if there are any limitations set on the number of victims' family members who are allowed to witness. That's up to the state. And I've never been involved in the process of a victim's family dealing with the Department of Corrections at that stage. So I'm not sure. But, if you add in all the law enforcement and state officials who oftentimes want to witness, I mean, it's quite a few people. Um, and I think since we're all split into different rooms, like the victim's family has their own area, and I think the prosecutor is in there with them oftentimes. Um, um, the mood differs. The journalists that I've been with in those execution chambers have been completely professional. very poised. If anybody else was having a really hard time with it, they weren't telling me about it. So I hugely admire their professionalism. Um, uh, One warden told me you hear cheering at times from the victims' families. That they react in a very positive way, and you know they're dealing with their grief and the kind of long process of the justice system that leads up to an execution. So I can't imagine what I would feel in their shoes. But obviously, in the perpetrator's family area, the personal witnesses for the offender, um, it's very hard. It's very sad. It's very grave. These are people watching their family members die. I listened to one elderly man I was sitting in the personal witness room with say, he had watched a child die to cancer, and he had watched other relatives die of different illnesses and accidents, and now he was going to watch, one of his only nephews die in a horrible way. And I felt terribly for him having gone through so much loss. And so I think that's kind of a reflection of what families are often thinking and going through.
You open up your article in a very personal place, talking about a nightmare that I think you said you have recurringly of being executed after witnessing so many of these. Why did you choose to start your article there?
Well, I didn't originally. I was just having a conversation with my editor, and she had asked a question, and I was saying something along the lines of, I mean, I'm thinking about executions all the time. I dream about them. I have execution nightmares. And she was like, put that in the story. That should be the lead. Um, I just thought, who cares? But that was her instruction. So there it is.
What it felt like to me is it announced right off the bat that this was a different kind of article about this topic than the usual right versus left, this side, that side, that this was going to tackle this issue from a completely different angle. And then it did that, which I have to say, I thought I knew what I thought about the death penalty. And it was an occasion to rethink it and realize that, what I thought was not necessarily the case anymore. That it was a different sort of thing than I had encountered. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for reading. I really love to hear that. I really appreciate it.
Do you, as a journalist, often there's a expectation of objectivity, and while you never clearly outright stated one position or another, I'm wondering, what is your relationship to objectivity, if any, on this beat you have of the death penalty anymore?
Well, yeah, I think objectivity is extremely important, and I certainly would never lie to people, or try to publish anything misleading. I think it's important to use data to tell the story of the death penalty. These sort of numerical figures that are, again, objective and easy to understand for people when they form their ideas about what's going on with the death penalty. Um, as a magazine reporter, your job is different than a newspaper reporter, or a newspaper opinion writer. It's sort of a hybrid thing where you do reporting and you do objective reporting, um, but also you take the reporting, the raw materials you've gathered, and you sort of weave it into a story. And in the weaving of the story, in the ordering of events, I think it's possible to, disclose, the writer's analysis of what's going on without hopefully making people feel like the piece doesn't have any room for them, that it's a straight A to B. You have to conclude what I want you to conclude. I don't want things to read that way. I don't think things that read that way are very interesting.
No. And you definitely linger over many of the arguments for and against, which are all things we've seen in those traditional articles. But you kind of give each one at least a moment, which I thought was really interesting to see them alongside these witnessing, which we don't usually get to see.
Thank you so much. I wanted to give, when you're kind of making an argument, I think it's important to demonstrate, that you have like a baseline level of respect for your opponent and what they think. And I didn't want to mischaracterize anyone who supports the death penalty, or, sort of paint them in such a way as to take them down. That's not true to who they really are, what they're saying. And so, I wanted to give all those arguments time.
Would you describe yourself as an advocate for anything on this topic?
Yeah, I'm fully an abolitionist on the death penalty. I think it should stop. Yeah.
Would you mind sharing why?
Yeah, well, I think there are so many problems with the death penalty. I mean, the signal moral problem is, the inviolable dignity of human life. It's not good to kill. I think this is like a very general commitment that lots of people can share. And it's not a situation where someone has to be killed. The person is incapacitated. They're restrained. They're in prison already, for sure. And if they're not executed, they'll be in prison for life. So I certainly don't think you can file it under a necessity and create an exemption for killing in this case. I don't think there's any logical grounds for that. So the grounds on which people argue in favor of the death penalty are generally that it's a deterrent. But again, data shows this is not the case. States with the death penalty routinely have higher homicide rates than states without. And I don't think that's an accident. I just don't think they function very well as deterrents for a variety of reasons. And the data supports that. Beyond the fact that it doesn't do what people say it does, the death penalty, I think, is oftentimes conceived of this kind of product of a sort of fair and equal justice. And we know that's not the case either. We know that there's extreme unfairness and errors in how the death penalty is carried out. There have been many exonerations from death row, which means courts do get this wrong, and it's not rare. I think something like 1 in 8 cases, you'd have to double check me on that, from the Equal Justice Initiative, found that there were, that many exonerations. And I think that's very serious and something that people should give a lot of thought to, this idea that we could be, and probably have in many cases. In fact, there are confirmed posthumous exonerations, that the death penalty kills innocent people. We know it does that. And, beyond that, it is often horrifically botched. It's difficult to carry out. We've been on this centuries-long quest to come up with a humane way to execute people, and we simply have failed to do that. So I think if we're going to pay attention to the Eighth Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment, you've got to take the death penalty down. Yeah.
I want to just pause there and say, your article, I had to put it down a few times over this one, because they have told us that lethal injection is a painless, humane way to execute somebody. But the descriptions that are real are, they've had to cancel executions because I'm assuming they can't find a real doctor to do it because of their oath. And they can't find a vein. And so you see these people come out with their arms black and blue because they've been poked for an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And then it can take a long time with them jerking around. It was harrowing.
Yeah, the executions of Joe Nathan James, Kinney Smith, and Alan Miller aren't even the worst botched lethal injections. There was an attempted execution of a guy named Doyle Lee Ham, also in Alabama, I think about a decade earlier. And they, again, couldn't find a vein, spent hours, piercing his veins and trying to access a vein, including in the groin. And they were so clumsy about what they were doing, they pierced his bladder with a needle.
And it's
Um,
because they can't find any healthcare workers who've taken the oath, correct?
Yes, that's what we believe. That they can't. It's very hard for them to recruit doctors into this because that's not what doctors signed up for. Doctors don't want to get caught doing it. Their licensure could be threatened in certain states. And so I suspect it's oftentimes healthcare workers who are not doctors, who are in fact like EMTs. And those people are the ones tasked with trying to locate these veins on prisoners. And that's not really their job.
Is it? Is there a chance it's just like prison guards?
I
Because
mean,
I feel like an EMT would be able to do it.
it's a good question. There's such secrecy
We don't
around
know.
what's going on in execution chambers that it could be anything.
And then it was the Alabama death row that switched to nitrogen hypoxia. And I'm like, okay, that sounds better. 22 minutes of suffocating and thrashing, you described.
Yeah. Yeah, nitrogen hypoxia is something people occasionally die of in industrial accidents. And oftentimes they don't realize that they're breathing in this extremely high level of nitrogen, low level of oxygen, and just pass out and then continue to suffocate, and die. And because of that, this guy who is named Stuart Creek, who is a screenwriter, that's his job, came up with this idea of nitrogen hypoxia, supposing that because that's how people die in industrial accidents and it seems painless, it would be painless used as an execution method in a very concentrated way. And that did not turn out uh, did not turn out to be the case.
Yeah, it was. So sorry to stop you in the middle of your description of like why you are an advocate against the death penalty, but I just want to underline that it honestly read like a horror movie script at times. Your article, just in um, how gruesome these situations actually appear.
Yeah, it's bloody, it's scary. It's hard not to empathize with the person who's going through it because it's a holy terror that these people are experiencing beyond the physical botch, beyond the mistakes that are made, by execution staff, just psychologically. That's a torturous position to be in. And I think that's probably why some people like the death penalty, but to me, it seems to really exceed the type of punishment we should be inflicting on people.
Yeah, and you also got to know some of the people on death row. Some were unrepentant and exactly the killers who were convicted up until the day they were executed, and others had changed.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I think something like 50% of people currently on death row have been there longer than 18 years. And in many cases, by the time you meet a guy who's scheduled for execution, that person's crime was 20, 25, 30 years ago. Oftentimes, these guys have been been in prison most of their lives, because the appeals process for capital punishment takes some time. And when I think about how I've changed since I was 24 to being 34, those are some dramatic changes. So you take those changes, that growth, that maturity, and multiply it a few times. And, that's the amount of time these people have had to change. Some people don't change. Um, you know, that's true of people in prison. It's true of people who are not in prison. Some with age don't turn around or reflect, and that's sad. But a lot of them, probably more than people would expect, do have a level of regret and remorse. Yeah.
You wrote in the article, um, but the death penalty is also morally indiscriminate in an additional way, in that it kills guilty people who may have become good people. By the time the execution arrives, the offender may be a completely different person from the one who took a life. We can't know the nature or potential of another's soul.
Yeah.
I was struck by the claim good people, that someone could go from the the worst kind of murderer that society has judged that by a jury to good people. Can you maybe share about someone or some story that could lead you to claim that that kind of level of transformation had occurred?
Yeah, I think the best example of that was a guy I knew named Jimmy Barber, who was it was an interesting case. He grew up in Connecticut and wound up in Alabama. And at the time of his murder, Jimmy was, extremely addicted to a number of substances. And the day of the murder itself, he had been on a multi-day crack binge, was also drunk, and was also high on opiates. He wound up breaking into the home or entering the home, I think that was never clear, of his girlfriend's grandmother, and wound up beating her to death with a hammer. Um, Jimmy was arrested, convicted, um, went to jail, and in jail, awaiting trial, he had his realization that his life was incredibly messed up, that he was out of control, that what he did was unforgivable. And he vowed to himself, and these are Jimmy's words, whether he walked out of prison or left in a body bag, he would leave a better man than he went in. And over the years, he took tons and tons of correspondence courses on the Bible. He was a very deeply religious person, counseled other guys on death row, had a spotless disciplinary record. He never got into a fight. He never bought contraband. He never so much as talked back to anyone. Jimmy was well loved by the guys on death row. And, towards the end of his life, when his execution was approaching, his victim's granddaughter wrote him a letter out of nowhere saying that she forgave him. She was tired of carrying the hatred around in her heart, and just wanted to let it go. So she let him know she forgave him. He wrote back and was, obviously beyond gracious and grateful. And they began a friendship, and they started talking. They talked on the phone. They got together. He was a source of good advice for her. Her name was Sarah. Um, and by the time his execution date came, the family didn't want to see him executed. The victim's daughter hugged him and gave him a kiss on the cheek the day of his execution. They didn't want to see it happen. Um, and I think that's a good example of, someone who seemed to have really profoundly changed in the decades that he was in prison.
Yeah, and I imagine anyone who has seen a loved one in the grips of a terrible addiction, like meth or opiates or
Mhm.
who knows what, and then gets sober, has seen transformations like that.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's still a really powerful story.
Yeah, yeah. Jimmy was a good guy. I'm glad I got to know him.
In your reporting, you go through some of the cases against the death penalty, including the Christian case for forgiveness and the Stoic case for mercy. And I was really struck by both of those. One, just because politically it's often, people who are at least politically Christian are often for the death penalty, which I find interesting. And two, Stoicism doesn't have as many, it's not a group that you hear politicians, curry favor to or something like that, even though a lot of people perhaps are um, influenced by their, thinking. Can you share just briefly those two arguments?
Yeah, so the Christian argument for forgiveness is just that we're ordered to do it. I mean, Jesus states it outright in the Lord's Prayer, which is, forgive us as we forgive those who trespass against us. And the idea is that as a Christian, you'll be forgiven to the degree that you forgave others. And, if you factor in that Christians believe they need forgiveness for, incredibly grave sins, every one of us, then you need to be distributing a lot of high quality forgiveness, as the opportunity comes your way. And so for Christians who are considering advocating for or against the death penalty, I would just say you have to leave room for forgiveness, for the possibility of forgiveness. Um, and and I think forgiveness sort of militates against vengeance. And I think a lot of support for the death penalty does touch on vengeance. Um, and then the argument for mercy, I mean, Christians are also commanded to show mercy. But mercy is distinct from forgiveness in that forgiveness is like an effective emotional thing that has to do with coming to see the person who offended you as like a moral equal again, and to have the same emotional um, regard for them as you did before the offense. So if you were strangers, you forgive the stranger. You say, you're once again a stranger to me. You're not a hated person. You're just like everyone else, and we go our separate ways. Forgiveness can look like that. um, in relationships, it obviously looks somewhat different. But mercy, on the other hand, just requires you to not give someone the most extreme penalty their offense calls for. So even if you want to stipulate that someone can deserve death, the Stoic case is that it's better to choose mercy, to not give them the most extreme punishment you possibly could. Not necessarily for them. Marcus Aurelius is not saying for the sake of the person, but for the sake of the person showing mercy. It is a good sort of psychological and intellectual discipline to control the passions, control the will.
Restraint.
Yeah.
There was there's a new book out called Unforgiving Places. Jens Ludwig. It's have you heard about it?
No, tell me about it.
Um, it's making an argument that our criminal justice system has set up these deterrences as if there is a system of punishments and rewards that people will consider before committing a violent act. But that the real problem is expressive violence, which means that someone gets a moment of passion, a moment of anger, something like that. If the temperature gets too hot, then they express that through violence. And Unforgiving Places references neighborhoods where they did things like green spaces and cleaning up lots. That saw a 29% drop in gun violence, which dwarfs any amount of like police boots you put on the ground or things like that. And I guess I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about why the people you met on death row, if there were any themes on why they did what they did, and if deterrence wouldn't have been a factor, what would have been?
Yeah, in Jimmy's case, he was on drugs. I mean, the thing that would have prevented it would have been Jimmy being sober. And so, it's hard to determine too much about him or his motives when it seems like there wasn't really a motive at all.
Yeah.
In the case of Joe Nathan James, I mean, he shot an ex-girlfriend out of anger. And that, I think, is clearly evil, but understandable. You can see someone getting really mad and doing something really inadvisable. It happens a lot. Alan Miller was mentally ill, and he was delusional at the time of his murders. And he thought there was a vast conspiracy against him at this trucking company where he worked. And he shot coworkers in the sort of grips of this delusion. So again, the motive was there. He thought there was a conspiracy against him. And so that's what motivated him. But the motivation has no basis in reality. And, I think you can pretty easily see how that doesn't, how that could come to pass. And then Kenny was paid. So there was the motive.
Wow.
He was given, he was paid some amount of money to participate in the assassination of this pastor's wife. Kenny himself did not kill her. His job was to ransack the house to make it look like a robbery. So that's what he was doing. The other accomplice killed her. He was also given the death penalty and died. Executed. Yeah, he was executed. So, I think you see a lot of motives. I would say mental illness is way up there, substance abuse, um, and then a lot of relational violence, murders of girlfriends, wives, partners, etc. Yeah.
In thinking of yourself as an advocate as well as a journalist, what do you say or imagine yourself saying? I don't know if these conversations happen to someone who has lost someone to violence
Mhm.
and wants the death penalty and sees that as closure and justice.
Yeah, I mean, to someone in that position, I wouldn't argue with them. I understand why someone in that position might feel that way, and I can't promise you that if it were one of my children, I wouldn't feel the exact same thing. Um, you know, Even people with strong intellectual commitments against the death penalty, once they are the victims of, or members of their family are victims of homicide, um, you know, you, those events have a huge effect on you, and can change your position and affect your position. And I understand why people who lose family members to violence can come to feel that way. Um, at the same time, I think we have to argue for death penalty abolition as a matter of public policy. I don't think it's helpful to engage in, debates about the good of the death penalty with, um, people who themselves are victims of homicide. But, to the degree that someone is looking for closure and looking for healing, I would just, try to gently suggest there are other ways of achieving that. Um, I would say Sarah Gregory, who was in touch with Jimmy Barber, she achieved closure and healing.
And there was a murder in your family that you shared about in the article. And I'm sorry, first of all, what a horrible thing for any family to go through. Was everyone in your family aligned on not wanting the death penalty? Were there conversations about it? How did your family cope in that difficult moment?
Yeah, so Heather was murdered in 2016 by an ex-boyfriend. When it happened, my husband and his dad, Heather's dad, um, did not want the death penalty. That was not something they were interested in or wanted to pursue. Heather's mom, my mother-in-law, said she was in favor of it, um, and my parents certainly were. But it turned out not to be a death penalty eligible case. Um, I wrote about my husband and his father because I just found their position so interesting and so striking. And not to brag, but my husband and my father-in-law are very special people, and they have I'm interested in them because they have this great moral sensibility. that comes very naturally to them, this inborn sense of justice. And I like that. I think it's cool. And so that was my interest in including them as a kind of example of these people who, again, did manage to find closure in a non-capital way.
It was a very, once again, a very personal aspect to this reporting that was surprising and really got you to look at the issue from new ways.
Well, thank you so much.
How do you, I don't know if, I know you're a journalist. I don't know if you know the history of how we got from, 100 some years ago, public executions well attended by big crowds, and before that, torturous executions, to the point now where they are much rarer and reserved for the worst crimes, and at least either trying not to be torturous or propagandized as if they are humane. Do you know how that happened? That progression?
Yeah, at the before the United States founding in the British colonies, there were hangings. I mean, I think the first hanging on what is now American soil took place, early or in the mid 1600s. So it was almost instantaneously after the colonizers arrived. That was, virtually that was unchanged well into the 1800s. There were still hangings. There had been some uses of firing squad, but only by militaries. It was mostly hangings. By the early modern period, there were still some burnings that took place. I mean, that happened here and there, but by and large, most things had moved in the direction of hanging. That became, sort of racialized in the antebellum South. You had lynchings that became, sort of spectacles that people were interested in, and that spectacle of the execution, it just sort of grew and grew as people became capable of traveling much easier, and news outlets became much better at reporting what was going on. People wanted to see these executions. They wanted to see these hangings. And around the turn of the century, there were so many people at these public hangings that this sort of elite of the time started thinking that these big crowds were not good, that they were being coarsened and their morals were being degraded by participating in what were really carnival-esque gatherings. There was food being sold and sort of like alcohol being consumed and people partying at packed hotels. It was a spectacle, and
You make it sound like a street fair. That's
yeah, no, it was very that was very much the attitude.
wow.
Yeah, people wanted to hear the sermons. Usually, there was a pastor who would deliver a sermon on the subject of mercy and forgiveness. People loved to hear those sermons. They could really activate a crowd, and that was something else that worried elites. And so, executions started to take place behind prison walls in front of just a select few people. And they changed from hangings generally to electrocutions for a while. And then when that didn't really work out, that led to a lot of really awful botches, people catching on fire and vomiting and bleeding from the eyes and stuff. So people tried the gas chamber at the mid-century. uh, you know, let's say a lot of people were using gas chambers in the mid-century, and to pretty evil effect. This was also a method that led to a bunch of really horrific botches, like people taking a very long time to die, sort of banging their heads on poles inside the gas chamber as they were poisoned to death. I mean, really suffering from nerve gas. Um, this sort of went on until lethal injection. Lethal injection was introduced in the 70s, and it was marketed as this quite humane way of executing people compared to electrocution, gas, hanging, all the sort of grisly methods of the past, burning, and so forth. Lethal injection was supposed to be this new frontier in carrying out humane executions, and unfortunately, it just didn't pan out that way. Lethal injection was not a panacea, and hiding these execution behind prison walls, it does make people less aware of what's going on in terms of executions, and I think to that extent, it helps uh, the death penalty survive.
Yeah. Yeah, I had no idea before reading your article, just how inept some of
Yeah, yeah.
the situations are with like just the trying to find a vein thing for hours. Just I hate getting poked with needles in general.
Any doctor you go to, I went to the doctor shortly after reporting this, and they had to draw blood. And I asked the technician who was drawing blood, I was like, "Do you always get the vein every time, or do you have to re-stick a lot?" And she was like, "No, honey, I get it every time." And I was
Yeah.
like, "They can't get one qualified person who can do this job in a death chamber.
I mean, it makes sense. Who would want to do it?
Nobody
And
wants to do it."
our healthcare workers rightly took took an oath not to harm, so they won't do
Yeah,
it.
they don't want to. That's not why people go into healthcare.
No, you know, the reason I reached out to you is one, this article really changed how I looked at the topic, and two, it just went into it in such a different way from other writing that I found myself going on like a journey. I think I had decided years ago that the reason I was against the death penalty was one of the first arguments that you talk about, which is just, well, the government might mess up, and it often does. There are innocent people who have been put to death, and therefore the government shouldn't do it. But when I was sort of looking at your article and how differently it was taking the issues, I realized there was an inconsistency there. That I do believe it is the appropriate role of the government to do tough things
Mhm.
when they are for the greater good.
Mhm.
And therefore, even if is sometimes done imperfectly, it is inconsistent to make an exception in this case for this very difficult thing, but of high importance to a lot of people. What is more important to a government than justice? And then, so I'm just reading your piece about how this happens and the people involved without really anchored and knowing what I thought about the issue anymore. Um, Eventually, when you got to talking about the Christian and the Stoic uh, arguments for forgiveness and mercy, um, I think I found the sort of new reason why, if I were to go into a voting booth and vote up or down, that I'm against it. And it's maybe slightly different. I just think, one, as someone who thinks about death a lot, there's sort of an absurd aspect as framing death, something everyone is already going to have at some point, as the ultimate punishment. Our lovely grandparents die. Do they deserve the same end as the worst killer? It doesn't really make sense
Mhm.
when you think about it.
Yeah.
And two, as someone who thinks about how the thoughts of death affect our mind a lot, I suspect there's an anti deterrence, as in a way in which, in as much as someone thinks about the death penalty, it probably increases the temperature a couple of degrees toward that tipping point rather than lowering it, because of whenever you bring in death, there's a romance. There's a reason why there's a death row records and not
Mhm.
a life imprisonment records. That the thought, I'm so angry at this moment that I'm willing to risk death row, is a thought that increases the temperature 2 degrees.
Mhm.
Whereas, I'm so angry I'm willing to risk life imprisonment. It's not the same
Yeah.
heightening. And for that reason, if it's an anti deterrent, and as much as it's in there, it's a harm against all of us if 1%. I don't think people think about consequences consciously that much, probably. But if there's 1% more murders because we have the death penalty, we should really get rid of it.
Yeah, fully agreed.
And it was so often there are these contentious issues, and when people are talking and you don't really think about what you really think, but somehow in the way that you took it, there was this spaciousness to reconsider what I thought and come to reasons that were more consistent with what I really believed than what I thought. And I don't know how you did that, but it was really remarkable to feel this permission and this space to really look at the issue in new ways.
That's great. Thank you so much. That's an extremely high honor. Thank you.
If some of our listeners want to follow this topic more, how can they follow your writing or your other reporting on this issue?
Subscribe to The Atlantic.
Subscribe to The Atlantic. It's a great magazine.
Thank you so much.
Anything else that you want to tell our audience about before we say thank you and goodbye?
No, I have to make dinner. So sorry.
No, thank you for being so generous with your time.
No, my kids are about to riot.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for coming on our program and talking about this important topic.
Thanks so much for having me.